Hello and welcome. You're on the Supernatural fandom track here at Continual, and I'm your host, Gail Z. Martin. Today we're going to be talking about God Was Never on Your Side, Chuck as villain, and I'm going to let my wonderful panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the heart of the matter. Go ahead, Stuart.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stuart Jaffe. I'm the author of over 40 novels, including the Max Porter Paranormal Mysteries and the Parallel Society Urban Fantasy. And I've been watching Supernatural since the first season. I'm that old. And I love the show. So.
Okay. Michelle?
I am Michelle Crowley. I am a professor at Northern Kentucky University. I do not have any published works under my name, like my other two fine panelists here. And I also have been watching Supernatural from the beginning. I am also that old. And even though I hadn't watched it continually, picked it up and put it down many times over the past 15 years, and more recently have fallen into this rabbit hole.
Cool.
Please say hi.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin. I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, and more, including some near future post-apocalyptic, which goes just fine with Supernatural. And then as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. So that's kind of who we are. Let's get to the heart of the matter. And, in season 14 and 15, we get the reveal that Chuck, aka God, is really the big bad villain. What do you think about that? I mean, some people are really struggling with that concept. Some people are going, I knew it all the time. And other folks are going, well, that's kind of interesting. What do you think?
Well, there's a lot of angles to what do you think?
and that's why we're here to talk about those angles.
I think from the initial, within the world of Supernatural, I think it makes perfect sense. And it was a perfect kind of reveal because it's the one where you realize I should have seen it all along. It makes perfect sense because angels are not good thing. They're not, they're dicks. Yeah. I mean, that's what that was the big revelation in the writing room when they figured out that they came in there like angels are dicks. That's how we're going to write this show. And that's followed through. So if angels are dicks, then God has to be the biggest of them all. So I think in that sense, like I said, it was an inevitable thing, especially if you think, even if you discount the angels themselves, just look at these boys' lives.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a God in that world, he is really crapping on Sam and Dean a lot.
Yeah, that thing about never be the chosen one. Michelle, what do you think?
Well, looking at it from, I guess, my own personal view, I like the fact that Chuck is the villain. I think it was perfectly timed because one of the things that goes on in pop culture is that it mirrors what is going on in real life. So pop culture, the writers and whatnot, look at what's going on in the world and say, yeah, we're gonna make this into entertainment. And they kind of put it through their mental meat grinders and gave us this new concept of, oh yeah, by the way, as the song says, God was never on your side.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very sad with the show ending, but I'm also glad that that is the final villain that they chose to attack.
Yeah, it was interesting because when we saw all this unfolding in season 14, and unlike you guys, I wasn't on board from the very beginning because in the entire decade of the 90s and then the early 2000s, I was chasing 3 kids, 7 and under. So if it wasn't on Nickelodeon or PBS Kids, I didn't get to watch it. And so I didn't get into Supernatural until halfway through season 11. at which point we binge watched all 11 seasons in 4 months so I could start live tweeting the beginning of season 12. I've been live tweeting it ever since. Totally went down the rabbit hole. Stuart's laughing because he's been there to see me go down the rabbit hole. And things just spiraled out of control. Now Supernatural is my life. But when I did the rewatch, watching all 14 seasons in 14 months before the kickoff for season 15, I'm going, you know, they didn't have any clue they were going to be on for 15 years. So this is not some master plan of seeding things from the beginning, but it's all there. You know, you go back and you have in one of their first encounters with Chuck saying, well, then I must be a god. I must be a cruel, capricious god. Okay. And then in all the Metatron, you know, he's an ass in a bar writing his memoirs while the world burns. And you're going, yeah, okay, I see this. So I'm really impressed that this was able to be stitched together when there could not have been a big master plan for, oh, and this is how we're going to end it.
Right. I do think there was probably sometime in the last at least three seasons, maybe even longer, somewhere along there, I think they realized if we ever get the chance to know we're going to end this show, this can be our ultimate villain, because it's the only thing that makes sense. I mean, if you're going to have a final showdown, it's going to be with Chuck. But I don't know. You might know, Gail. I have no idea when they decided for, like, because this was their decision, right, to end the show. So it's not, you know, I think they kept in their back pocket if ever, you know, the studio says to us, okay, this is it, and they have enough time, they would write that in. But somewhere along the line, they wised up and said, hey, if we just end this on our own, we can do it all on our own terms, which I'm really proud of them for doing that. And as much as it hurts to see it go.
Mm-hmm.
With having the same showrunner, well, even if he wasn't showrunner the whole time, Andrew Dabb being involved since season 5, that, you know, he still had a hand in things. And, you know, a lot of the writers have been on board for many, many, many years. And so they, even though there's not necessarily a writer's table that they sit down at, they still toss ideas back and forth and, you know, put different little Easter eggs into each other's stories. And that's what, you know, really makes the complexity of the series as well.
Well, and I think, to go back to your question, Stuart, from all the quotes I've seen, and Michelle, if you've seen something additional or different, please say so, but all the quotes that I've seen have said that Jensen and Jared admitted they've been talking about when the show should end for the last couple of years. And, you know, certainly in, I think from 13 on, they only started doing, or maybe it was 14, 15, they only started doing 20 episodes instead of 23, because it was just getting to be too hard with the families in Austin, kids getting older and all of that. And let's be honest, doing that red eye back and forth between Vancouver and Austin was a lot easier when you were 27 instead of 37, even if it is Jared's plane. So I think they've been talking about it for a couple of years, and that does give them the chance to make a coherent ending, because I think from the clips I've seen in the interviews, that was also really important to them, is they wanted to have, they've come all this way, let's not just stop the story because we got cut off. Let's tell a story ending.
Especially, see, there's so many, the list of great shows that had horrible endings, either even planned endings, but you know, a lot of times they weren't planned endings, is just enormous. So the fact that they, and I think it's obvious that the Supernatural the people who put the show together have embraced the fandom as a family, and so I think they felt a duty to actually do their best job at finishing this on a high note, which you generally don't see in even wonderful television series. They usually don't care. Not that they don't care about their fans, but not to the level, you know, not just Sam and Dean, but all the actors, all the writers, producers, they all realize, because it's been 15 years, that fandom has given them more than just a livelihood. That a lot of them could have gone on to other things, but it's given them a steady livelihood, a guarantee, which in the arts, I mean, Gail knows this as a writer, but certainly it's probably even worse as an actor. If your face is what is your brand, and that changes as you get older, you can't guarantee that's going to be your brand forever. So I think I get the sense, and of course I haven't seen season 15 at all yet. I'll come out when it's done for me. But all the way even through season 14, where you could, in retrospect, you can see they were setting up. They knew where they were going. There was a lot of love and care for fans, not fan service, but just care to do it right. I appreciate that.
Michelle, your thoughts?
I've gone to a couple of these supernatural conventions, and there's always the question asked to Jensen and Jared of, how is the show going to end? What are you going to do? And they both said that they purposefully are very involved in different storylines of season 15. So, so we have, there's different loose ends being tied up that maybe have been frayed since season 6 or season 7. And they actually, when did they let the demons out of hell?
Which time?
Oh, sorry, the first time.
Well, that would have been
season 2 to 3?
Something like that.
Season 2?
End of season 2? Yeah. I mean, there was a hunter from season 2 is shown in season 15. And
yeah, season 3, because Sam got killed at the end of season 2. That was all hell breaks loose. So it has to be season 3. Or was that the wait?
It was the Devil's Trap. The Samuel Colt storyline, and when John goes to heaven.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, these storylines, the guys know that there's the fans out there that they absolutely follow this story, follow word by word everything that goes on, and they want to do right by those fans too. And that's, I really respect that out of the actors. And like Stuart said, there have been some other wildly popular TV shows that their endings have just fallen flat. And
let's be clear, nobody wants to be Game of Thrones.
Right.
Okay.
Or Full House, or Friends.
Or Lost.
Or Lost.
Yeah. And The Sopranos kind of left us hanging. That was one of those really clever but not so good kind of.
But I would say for The Sopranos, though, not that we want to go off into different shows, but for The Sopranos as an example, that was an artistic choice. It may not have been a successful artistic choice for some people, but it wasn't like they just ran out of steam, or they just, they actually, I give them credit for trying something, whereas other shows just kind of weaseled out, or even the X-Files just fizzled. They lost David Duchovny, and they just kept limping into obscurity,
Well, and we're going to do a whole separate panel on how we think the show should end. This is kind of getting back to the whole God issue, and who Chuck has been over the course of the series. We've seen him as sort of a, how did Dean describe him, a squirrely little guy? Kind of this weird sort of, I don't know, twerpy guy. And then we get that he's really the twerpy guy with a big chip on his shoulder who kind of wants to take everybody down. What do you think about the evolution of how we've seen God and what we've seen of him through all the show?
I'll take this one.
Okay, yeah.
So one of the things with, let me take a step back. One of my focuses of study is in villains and evil. And so I've got stacks of books literally sitting next to me right here where it's like, I can reference that right now. But
you and I are going to be doing a whole separate panel on villains, and I can't wait.
Yep. So one of the things that, especially in Western mindsets, that our idea of a God comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, there is this one omnipotent, typically male figure that just kind of watches and sometimes intervenes, answers a prayer here and there, but you know, he always has our back. With Chuck, they immediately, right out of the gate, when we first meet Chuck, he is in his underwear. You know, when he shows up in the monster at the end of this book, I mean, he's sitting there in his bathrobe, and he's twerpy, yeah, and so he's this, I have it written in my notes, wimpy white guy writing fan fiction in his boxers, immediately removing the divinity of a God character. I mean, it's also, I'm just going to go out on a limb and say they thought the writers knew he was God at that point, even if it wouldn't be revealed till later on. There was probably that in the back of Kripke's mind, saying, we're going to find God where we least expect it, in his boxers writing fanfic. And what that removing of divinity did, it puts God on the same level as you and me, as human beings. He's not, he's not in heaven, obviously, as we find out with the angels. He's not in heaven. He is among us, and he is among us screwing things around. Because as a writer, he is able to write the story, and if he doesn't like it, he backspaces out of it and rewrites it differently.
Which kind of screws with the traditional conception that God among us is a good thing because he's here to help.
Right.
Not so much in Chuck's case. And that's kind of a mind screw.
Well, and I'd add to that at least from a writing perspective, you know, we're taught that a good villain, not good, a well-written villain is the hero of their own story. It's a classic saying.
Good morning, everyone. I'm glad I could finally join you.
Hey, Amy, we can't see you.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to put video on right now. That's going to be a few minutes because I'm still working, but I can join in by phone for now.
Okay, well, hold on, because Stuart's in the middle of, we're talking about, obviously, Chuck, and we're glad you could join us, but we're kind of talking about the concept of God and villainry. So back to Stuart.
But I think in this case, one of the things that makes him such a unique villain is that I don't like, how do I say this? Like in a typical story, you know, the villain is got their master plan to destroy whatever, half of humanity because they want to, in their eyes, you know, make the world better. But that's not Chuck. Chuck is there, to him, I mean, he made the world to begin with, and I always see it like it's his toy. In the supernatural world, it's his toy, and the toys aren't doing what he wants them to do, and he tries to play with it, but but in the 14th season, it's almost like a better analogy would be a pet, because the pet bit him back at the end of the season, and now he's pissed, and it's not some noble, I'm the hero, so I'm going to just do something. It's not that at all. He's really just being a dick because he's pissed off.
He's being really petty.
Yeah. But what does it matter to him? If he destroys the world, you can make a new one. You know, it's not, that's what I think makes him such a potentially terrifying villain, because unlike a human villain, there is no moral issue. He's the one who even decides what morals are, right? Everything we normally attribute to a villain, good or bad, does not apply to him. And that's really what makes him, I think, so dangerous. For me, those final moments of season 14, where he's just like, Sam, I think it was Sam, shot at him, right?
Hmm.
And the look on Chuck's face of like, you did not just, yeah, I got chill. I was like, oh man, can the next season start right now? Because the fallout is going to be huge. And
the villain that it reminds me of most is Q from Star Trek Next Generation.
yes.
And also, and I'm blanking on his name, it was a Q-like character in the original series, Trelane, who was the bratty little boy who was screwing around with them and pretending to be God until his parents came and told him that playtime was over and he was not being good, and so he was going to be punished severely for not being good to his toys, and plucked him out. And it's that same kind of heavily entitled, highly privileged, very powerful assbutt.
Like Kylo Ren.
Yeah. And so, Michelle, I'm intrigued from your villain lens here. What do you see of Chuck's genesis and evolution through all of this?
I think it is classic. Well, all right. Let me formulate my thoughts here for a second. When we encounter villains in any movie or TV show, they are a reflection of what's going on in the world. They are a reflection of who we are afraid of. So, Darth Vader, faceless, machine, kills without empathy. He was big and terrifying, quite like some of the stuff, from the 1970s. Kylo Ren, entitled little millennial brat, pissed off that he can't, get his own way. And I think we get to see Chuck go through that same change that Star Wars got to do over 40 plus years. Chuck has done it in 15 seasons or 10 seasons. And that's one of the things that makes this, it's why we're talking about it. It's why it's why it's on everyone's mind, is because we actually get to see the same characters change kind of from our own concept of it to this new writer's mentality 2020 view of it. So 2010 to 2020, we had a big change in who's the bad guy. And we get to see Chuck being the bad guy all the way through. So that's one of the things that I am super excited to see just how it ends, because I can't even tell you how I think it's going to end. But I love watching Chuck and seeing how much more like 2020 can he become.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you brought up Kylo Ren, because, when he really first came up, I looked at him and said, oh my God, we've basically got a trench coat mafia Dylan Klebold wannabe with a lightsaber. And that's who we're afraid of right now. We're afraid of, loose cannon young men with anger management issues. And that's Kylo Ren. So I think it's very interesting that now we're looking at a very different kind of villain. Amy, I know you had some work stuff that came up that kept you from joining us on time. Give us a quick hello and tell us who you are, and then jump into the fray, because we're talking about, did we see this coming with Chuck and God as the bad guy? And you're muted. You're muted.
Hi, I'm Amy. I live just outside of DC. I've been a little occupied today because I'm a volunteer with Black Lives Matter, so we have a lot of protests going on today, and I've had to send de-escalators all over the place so far. It's been a very busy morning. But to get up to speed with this, I am someone who thinks that Chuck is definitely not himself, but currently acting as a villain. I think there is some sort of outside pressure or force that is twisting Chuck's behavior, because this is simply out of character for his past actions, and I'm interested in finding out how that's going to play into the conclusion of the series.
Now that's interesting because, and we had you and one of our other potential panelists got held up, so we may have one more person joining us, and you guys were the kind of pro-Chuck faction on the panel. So we've kind of been talking about ourselves going, yeah, this really kind of adds up. If you go back and do the rewatch, yeah, we can kind of see the seeds of this. You know, I'm not really sure we ever really had a good handle on Chuck. So you obviously interpreted Chuck differently to think that he's not just kind of coming into his own.
Right, absolutely. I've never, you know, looking at Chuck, I have always had the concern that, you know, that his character, while very powerful, was very passive and, you know, very uninterested in the way that things were going. And then all of a sudden there is a switch flip to a suddenly angry Chuck that has multiple worlds going and all this other stuff. And to me, the numbers just don't add up for that. So I am fairly well convinced that there is some sort of outside force that is influencing Chuck's behavior at this time.
Now, it's interesting because I have heard, you know, there's so many people who have been with the show for whatever length of time who have really strong personal, what supernatural fan doesn't have strong personal feelings, but every cast. I mean, it's the show. But there are some folks who kind of are taking the whole Chuck arc very seriously because I think there's a little bit of discomfort between perhaps Chuck/God as a fictional character and maybe some of their personal views about God.
I am not Christian, so that does not affect my viewpoint in any way. I am looking at it. For background, I am a content marketer and researcher, so messaging and consistency is what I do every single day for work. And the first thing that I noticed very quickly in Chuck's behavior is how far off of message and inconsistent that it has been to his previous appearances on Supernatural, leading me to believe that there is an outside force that is influencing his behavior and his actions to go in this direction. So I'm not per se a fan of Chuck in the first place, or very attached to the Godhead concept in Supernatural. What I'm more interested in is the extreme change in characterization, and whether or not that is a flag for other influences or other entities being involved that we are not putting into the equation.
Now, one thing that I might be, I can see that would kind of back up in my mind, even with all the corroborating things that Michelle and Stuart and I have talked about, is that all of a sudden Chuck grew a spine.
Yes. And that is unexpected. He's also gone from being a little bit modernist and snarky and kind of casual in his manner of speech and word choice into being a little bit more formal and a little bit more Old Testament in the way that he's speaking about things.
He's kind of gone full King James on us.
Yeah, and it's really unusual and unexpected. So I am suspicious as to whether there is some unexpected outside influence, which would be a totally supernatural thing to do, or if perhaps, you know, there has been some dissonance in the writer's room, which would also be a totally supernatural thing to do.
It could just be a Buck Lemming thing, you know?
Absolutely. The dissonance could be causing it. But
it could be a Buck Lemming thing. There's a lot of fandom that doesn't completely trust Dab, female looking. My biggest fear, and we'll talk about the ending, for the show in another panel, but I've said before, you can do an ending that is a love letter to the fans. You can also do an ending that gets you as the showrunner publicity and variety going, did you see what they did there?
yeah,
That is necessarily good for the show or the fans, but hey, look, you made the cover of Variety, and that's good for you, the showrunner. And the verdict's still out on which Dab is going to do. The only problem with having Chuck controlled by somebody, unless it turns out to be Amara, is that as a writer, I have a real problem with introducing a brand new force in the last 7 episodes of a 15-year show, just like I have a real problem introducing a new romantic relationship that has never been there in the last 7 episodes. That's another panel of a 15-year show. We'd get nailed to the wall by our editors if we tried that in a book. It's just bad plotting. So,
and I would do that with a copywriter who was bringing something like that to me.
yeah, I really hope that, but that isn't the case. Michelle.
In particular, in Supernatural, in this very specific instance, it's even worse to do that because you're talking about introducing something that's powerful enough to control God. So
that's why I'm not particularly looking at a new force, or by outside force, I mean a force that is not Chuck. I totally think that there are forces that have been mentioned and encountered in the universe that are powerful enough to exert that kind of action, especially if Chuck isn't quite as almighty as he has portrayed himself to be.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's an interesting point, because who were the creepy Crowleys that Asmodeus tried to get Jack to bring out of get him split open a cleft in the ground, and they were sort of zombie-ish things, but they were supposed to be like older than time or something. And then we never heard again. Michelle, from your villain background, not that you're a villain, but you study villains. From your villain background, about this powering villains up and down, comics kind of do it all the time. Where are we on the villain spectrum here? See, even on Zoom, I have to get my hands into it.
See, I never thought about Chuck being scaling up or scaling back. I've just seen him as, this constant rise of power. But I'm on board with you guys saying that it is bad writing if we have to be introduced to a new, almighty, powerful, scary force within the last 7 episodes. And I hope that everybody has more respect for the fans than to make that happen. But it's if you look at like with the Avengers, we had a handful of, at least for me, because I was not a comic book person per se until more recently, that when the first Avengers movie came out, we're like, oh yeah, Loki, he's a bad guy. It's like, but by the end of the movie, we know that there is somebody else. There is something else out there. And I don't even know where I was going with that now.
Well,
welcome to paneling. That happens all the time.
Yeah. Well, the thing that brings me back, though, sometimes to the whole Chuck as villain, God as villain is, and I love the way that Supernatural has always done its homework. The whole Enochian thing comes from the Book of Enoch. There is actually legend and lore and tradition there, down to the alphabet. Everything they've done with the angels, there's precedent there. If you go back into the lore, their end times dispensationalism straight out of the lore. So if you go into some of the dark corners of the lore that never make it into the weekly lectionary at church because they're problematic, you get some really weird stuff. where God is very fickle. I mean, there's one short segment where God gets pissed at Moses and chases him through the desert to kill him. And his wife actually saves him in a very bloody and not suitable for work discussion way of shedding that blood and basically saying back off. And that's not one they ever preach on, because it's like, whoa, what were you smoking, God? You know, this, you just kind of went off the rails here. This is your guy, Moses, you know, you don't go killing him. So if you're pulling from lore, aside from any emotional feeling of belief in that lore, there's some weird stuff to pick from. But we also then have the Amara character, who isn't really in the lore per se. And we haven't seen her since Reno. So where do you think she comes in with the whole Chuck as villain piece? Because they don't seem to be agreeing, but he's acting more like her than him.
So Supernatural doesn't just pull from the Judeo-Christian tradition. There's a lot of polytheistic and some monotheistic religions that do have a kind of a double-sided coin of their god. I was looking up this morning on the Zoroastrianism,
Mm-hmm.
and they're a monotheistic religion, but their almighty has a dark side. Sometimes it's his twin, sometimes it's, you know, him on a bad day or something like that. But that character of the bad side wakes up, and then when he encounters a good man or, you know, a challenging situation, goes back to sleep. And then, you know, something else happens, bad guy wakes up, and then he goes back to bed. You know, it's kind of this balance that they're creating. And so I think that's a big thing with Amara, is that she's sleeping right now. She was locked away since the beginning of time. She got out, she was active, she caused a lot of headache, a lot of problems, and then she's back to sleep. I mean, she's having fun in Reno. She likes shopping, she likes crabs. I just watched this episode last night. And so she's, you know, she's happy being quiet right now.
Yeah, and that dualism is an interesting point. And the Judeo-Christian God had his bad days of smiting people. You know, there's a whole lot of smiting going on in the Old Testament. And that gets kind of forgotten sometimes when we start talking touchy-feely and love, but there was a whole lot of smiting going on. And so, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what they do with Chuck, because he was a lot more passive-aggressive in his, you know, earlier in the show, and now he's gotten aggressive. And that's either a switch, or that's a new side of him we haven't seen, or maybe switching to a new location that would be a little better. There we are. So yeah, that's interesting, bringing in that dualism, which is part of so many other religious traditions. We're talking dualism, and
by audio.
There we are. We got you back.
Okay. Yeah, I've been following by audio to make sure that I was keeping up with the discussion as I moved. I see the interesting point that you were making with Amara, but to go back to what Michelle was saying about villains in comics and how they evolve throughout in power level throughout their journey. I think that is potentially something that they are doing with Chuck. You had mentioned Loki with the Avengers, and throughout comics history, Loki has had varying power levels that allow him to do certain things. And while I can see adjusting villains' power levels through the use of outside forces to really create your story as something that writers would do, it is both incredibly lazy writing to do that, and very strange for it to be done without an explanation. So I find it to be a little choppy and strange for them to choose to do it now, but at the same rate, I have always been suspicious of Chuck's almighty power level, given the fact that he has historically, personally, not been able to affect a lot of change on what is going on right then and there. I mean, if you look at his initial confrontations with Amara, and then going down to the confrontation that they had with Amara, with Rowena, and Crowley involved, and a lot of other folks, he was unable to overcome her, even though he was the supposed all-controlling god of this universe.
Well, it's interesting that at all those other times, if he had that much power, he didn't use it. So that makes you wonder, did he have it? Did he say he was just walking away when he really couldn't have done anything? Stuart, you look like you've got something.
Well, I was going to say that essentially the same thing there, but that we don't know. But if we look at it that he does have this power, then that means in all those other moments he chose not to. And what makes him another aspect, I think, that makes him an interesting villain in this case, and this probably wouldn't work in most stories, but in this case, we've rarely seen him. He's a constant presence in a sense, but it's not like he's got a lot of episodes in which he features prominently and we learn a lot about him.
We know Lucifer much better.
Much better. Yeah, absolutely. And so, and in fact, a lot of episodes that reference him are, where's Chuck? Because he ain't here helping us.
Where's Waldo?
So
His behavior has been consistently, you are absolutely right, inconsistent throughout his appearances in the series. So that begs the question of, could he always have been doing, large world-changing things? Or can he not do those things because he is not really the supreme force in this universe?
Right. And I think they've purposely, from a how the sausage is made kind of thing, writers often will put in ambiguity like that so that we can do whatever we want later and play it either way. And I think especially in the beginning, they were probably laying the groundwork and not necessarily sure where they were going to go with it. And so I think they can, and there's easy ways to justify whichever direction they want to go. They've done that very well. That he's an uncaring God. The reason he hasn't chosen to do anything is, as I was using the metaphor earlier, that the earth is his pet or his toy, and he's just letting to see what it goes until it bites him, and then he gets mad. And then, and now we're seeing what happens when we actually see who he really is. Or they could turn around and play it as Amy is suggesting, that there's other forces that are manipulating him or using him in one way or another, and that could play off easier as well. In that case, the God we've always seen, this kind of weaker, less involved God, is actually what we have. And I could buy it either way, as long as they choose one and go with it.
They've already kind of established that there are forces that are extremely powerful and outside of Chuck's control through the use of the empty. So it wouldn't surprise me if the empty or a similar entity, or perhaps death or a similar entity, has the power to change the way that Chuck acts. When we saw Death originally, he told Dean that he would reap God too. So that leads me to believe that Chuck is not the supreme ruler of the universe.
Well, we also do have the empty out there as another potential really big bad.
Right. With only 7 episodes left, they could get away with bringing back something like the empty, in which case it would create a really interesting. They'd have to get started on it right away with only 7 episodes, but you could end up having a thing where basically, rather than fighting God, Sam and Dean have to save God to save everything. And that's an interesting twist as
Speaks
well.
to some of the nihilism of the series to choose to go in that direction.
So Michelle, when you look at villains across the board, what precedent, if any, is there for this sliding villain power scale?
There really isn't. And because the villain, just like the hero, is constantly evolving, we really are in new territory. And we're to the point now where, you know, we have those 7 episodes left. They have 2 episodes left to film. And it, you know, we're all staring down this metaphorical gun at this point. It's like, where do we go from here? And it's a question that we end up asking ourselves personally too. It's like, where do I go from here? I've never been as old as I am right now. What am I doing? What you know, what is my next step? And I think that's, you know, if we have Chuck being on this sliding scale, you know, if he's, you know, sliding to the top, if he's, you know, sliding back and forth, if he's, you know, it's kind of what we do. And that's also a reason that, like, I can't hate the guy. Like, I hope I don't ever piss him off, but man, I don't hate Chuck.
So you mean, what if God was one of us, just a slob like one of us? What do you think? And you know, we're talking about people being able to change. They threw in that right curve with this idea that Chuck pushed, that Sam and Dean only were ever able to do all the things they did because he gave them extra luck, and then he took the luck away. And everybody's going, wait a second, these guys have trained paramilitary since they were toddlers. Surely they have a basic higher than average human skill level, even if, you know, he did give them extra bonus rounds. And then of course they get the luck back from Fortuna. I found both of those, both the taking away of the luck and then Fortuna giving it back to them, that really fucks with agency and free will. and at the heart of this show is that whole idea of kind of predestination and team free will. So in our last, you know, several minutes, can we hash that out a little bit as we're talking about God as villain?
I have a strong opinion on that when it's my turn to talk.
I do think, again, from a writing standpoint, I think it was just a misstep of theirs that they were trying to basically give a reason for the fact that these 2 boys have lived and died and lived and died and lived and died so many times. They've been to hell and back several times, and to try and give some kind of reason that they're not superheroes. So how are they managing to do what no other human beings could possibly do? But as you said, and that's what went to my mind, is that it stripped them of their agency. And so I think that was one of those things where they were trying to do a little high wire act, and they teetered a bit there as the writers.
Amy?
I think it's more complex than that, because although I do agree with what you're saying, I'm going to go in a totally different direction with this. I don't think that actually happened. I think that Sam and Dean were led to believe that it happened, and they just had kind of a bad day. I feel as though Chuck saying that and doing that, based on his past actions and based on the way that we've seen magic and like curses and things work in the past in the show, I don't think that Chuck had initially given them some sort of blessing that made them, you know, superheroes. I think that he either convinced them that he had, and they just had some screw ups and thought that is what happened to them, or he manipulated magical forces to give them a negative when there wasn't necessarily a positive given by him in the first place, in order to perpetuate his story of, see how look how powerful I am. I have given you this and I can take it away from you, when actually it was not something that he had provided in the first place, so it was not something that he could take away.
He just stacked the deck for the optics of the situation.
Yes, and we've seen other characters do that in the past, so it wouldn't be so strange for the show to choose that direction, but I think it speaks to Chuck not being as powerful as he claims to be. So
Well, the
he
certainly
has to
very
resort
much.
to trickery to convince people that he is.
Well, and if you look at all the crap that the Angels pulled on Sam and Dean with the trickery back during the whole Michael and Lucifer issue, there's a precedent for that. Michelle?
Yeah, it's not terribly off-brand for Heaven.
No. And I had to learn it somewhere. Michelle?
All right, so I had an answer formulated, and then Amy said something, and I was just like, so I'll give you the formulated answer first, and then we'll go into my brain explosion. So I feel like the first off, the title of that episode, When All of Their Luck Goes Away, is The Hero's Journey, and a nod to Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, Hero's Journey monomyth. And we see within the course of that episode, the whole, circular storytelling of the monomyth. And also, I initially thought that that episode, while really cool and fun to break down, we actually did about a week and a half in one of my classes doing the typology of that episode and whatnot. It was fun. And so not only was it the nod to the hero's journey, but I think it was also a nod to the fans saying, yeah, we recognize the fact that the Impala has never broken down. We recognize the fact that Sam and Dean can pick a lock with only one half of a lock-picking set. We realize all of this stuff, and it was the writers kind of winking at the audience saying, yeah, we know. Let's just have fun with it. Okay, going off of what Amy said, you said the key word that just really kind of vibrated in my brain, a bad day. In comics, the Joker has one bad day, turns dark side. And the Wicked Witch of the West, according to the play, the stage show Wicked, has a bad day and kind of snaps and goes amok. Maybe this episode, the Hero's Journey episode, was Chuck, still powerful, says, I wonder if I can push the boys over the edge. I mean, granted, there's a lot of ways he could have done that, but he chose, just the fact that Sam trips over his own feet and apparently forgets how to use a pot holder. What? And Dean gets a parking ticket. Can just these little human things, maybe, Chuck is fascinated by the fact that, oh yeah, there's this thing called a parking ticket. Can these just little human things, are they enough to push a person over the edge?
And we've seen them go into really bad luck sessions before. A Bad Day at Black Rock is a famous, explanation of that. And I'd also like to point out that that was not Dean's first parking ticket. He has gotten several.
He also got towed.
Yes, the Impala has been towed. It has had problems, and he has gotten parking tickets, because I think that's very funny. But it's not as impactful as Chuck would like it to be. And I think that is a very interesting, it's a very interesting way that his power acts. It's not acting all that different than the cursed object from Bad Day at Black Rock, or a similar witch or magical curse would act on them. So to me, that says, how powerful is Chuck really? Is he about as powerful as Rowena? Or a well-made but strong cursed object? How does he actually fit into the scale? And have we been being lied to this whole time about his ability to affect change?
And folks, as with any supernatural discussion, we could do this all day. And if we were in a bar someplace, like at Supernatural Chicago, where I thought I was going to be this weekend, we would, but we can't. So we're pretty much out of time. So how about if we go through everybody and we'll start with Michelle. Tell us where we can find you online, and then we're going to have to call it a day, and we can continue this in the comments. Go ahead, Michelle.
All right, you can find me on Twitter at preheatingprof.
Okay. Amy?
I run corporate social media, so you can find me online at Amy McNeal on Facebook, and you can also sometimes find me in person at the comic shop that my husband and I own in Silver Spring, Maryland, Alliance Comics, one of the oldest comic shops in the nation.
Cool.
And you can find me on Facebook at Stuart Jaffe Author, I think. And I have my website, stuartjaffe.com. You can sign up for my newsletter, get some free books and short stories and good stuff like that.
I'm Gail Z. Martin. You can find me online at gailzmartin.com, morganbryce.com, and pretty much Twitter and Instagram and Pinterest and everything else is either a Gail Z. Martin or a GZ Martin or a Morgan Bryce. I make it pretty easy for you to find me. Folks, this has been the Supernatural Fandom Track for Continual, the online, ongoing, multi-genre fandom con that never ends. We'll have more of the Supernatural love, legend, and lore coming up with the track, but I want to say thank you so much to our wonderful panelists today. And I guess we're just going to have to wait and see about whether or not God was never on our side. Thank you guys so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having us.